Hello, my name is Leslie Gordon, and I am the Executive Director of the Bremen Jewish Heritage Museum in Atlanta. We are coming to you live from Midtown Atlanta location in the Selig Center, which houses the Jewish Federation of Greater Atlanta. This is our Bearing Witness series, Unforgettable Stories from the Holocaust. We appreciate you joining us today. I would like to acknowledge the Rich Foundation for funding this series and thank our community partner, Hemshech. It is now my pleasure to introduce Rabbi Joe Prass, Director of the Weinberg Center for Holocaust Education here at the Bremen. Rabbi Prass?
Each and every story from the Holocaust tells a different aspect of survival and courage. And what an important activity to be doing just a few days after January 27th, the International Yom HaShoah Remembrance Day. Today, we'll learn of the plight of the Jews of France as told through the eyes of Manuela Bornstein. Following World War I, France was one of the most liberal countries and as such welcomed Jewish immigrants. And Jews viewed France as a land of equality and opportunity. And Paris became a vibrant center of Jewish life. And yet, as the Nazis rose to power during the 30s, Jews began to flee the persecution in Germany. Just prior to the Nazi invasion, there was about 350,000 Jews living in France. Less than half of them were French citizens. And then on May 10th, 1940, the German forces rolled into France, and about 6 weeks later, France signed an armistice and with Germany annexed the border of Alsace-Lorraine. In addition, the remainder of the northern and western France remained under a German military commander. And then in southern and eastern France, the Germans allowed for a short time the French to govern themselves under the headquarters set up in the city of Vichy. Make no mistake, the collaborationist government was far from independent. And then in the autumn of 1940, the Vichy administration promulgated anti-Semitic legislation closely modeled after the German oppressors. Meanwhile, following the Wannsee Conference in January of 1942, German authorities began deporting Jews from France at an accelerated pace. They began rounding up Jews in the occupied zones. With the Allied landing in Normandy in June of 1944, at great human cost, France was quickly liberated. By the end of the war, it is estimated that between 70 and 90,000 of the Jews in France had perished during the war. It is against this backdrop that Manuela was a small child who witnessed the invasion and fled with her family from Paris. Manuela has been an incredible steward of her family's testimony, speaking to groups of all ages in areas near and far. She has told the plight of her parents and siblings. And what I can tell you is that despite the fact that the pain is still very deep every time she speaks, she is a woman of kindness, sweetness, and caring, and it's a pleasure to greet her every time she comes to speak. After the movie, Manuela will join us for a few remarks, and then we will open up for questions and answers that you can type the questions into the chat function to our panelists. Now, please sit back as we watch Bearing Witness, the story of Manuela Mendels Bornstein.
My name is Manuela Mendels Bornstein. I was born in Paris in August 1933. 1933 is the year when Hitler came into power officially. My life in Paris before Paris was occupied was that of a happy child. I have a sister who is a little younger than me. We were best friends. We went to school together. My father went to work. My father had his business. My mother was a happy housewife. She made many friends. We had many non-Jewish friends, which helped us a lot later on. My grandparents, who lived in Holland, came to visit. And my grandmother, my mother's mother, who lived in Hamburg, she came to visit also. And she didn't speak any French. So I tried to teach her some French, but she was not a good student. And she tried to teach me some German. My father's business was import and export of fancy foods, and he traveled by train to bring samples from France and bring back samples from various countries in Europe. And in 1938, I believe, he went on one of his trips, he went to visit my grandmother to encourage her to leave Germany and come move in with us in Paris. Because at that time, Germany was very much under the law of the Nazis, and life had become very difficult. She said, like many German Jews, unfortunately, "Oh, I'm German, they can't do anything to me. My parents were German, my grandparents were German. It's not that bad." Unfortunately, it became that bad. And my father, when he came back, said that he would never set foot in Germany again because he could see what it was. He could see the swastika all over. He could see German Jews being arrested and beaten in the street. Once Paris was occupied, our life changed, very much so. We could no longer go to the movies. We could not go to the theater. I could not take swimming lessons anymore. We were no longer allowed to go in the park. There was a sign outside that said, forbidden to black, dogs, and Jews. I didn't know what was going on. I was a little girl, I was sheltered. I didn't know that we were being invaded or occupied. I didn't know that. I remember the first day I went to school wearing the yellow star. I was wearing either a green or a brown suit that my mother had knitted. This was in April 1942. And it stood out, the yellow star, the bright yellow, stood out on whatever I was wearing. So I hung my jacket in the hallway, like we all did, but my teacher saw it. So she asked me to go back and get my jacket and put it on. And she asked me to come into the classroom and to stand on the platform. And she was a very brave lady. She made a very nice speech, exhorting the children to be good to me because the Germans were after the Jews and they should be especially nice to me. This was dangerous for her because the children could have told their parents, you know, there's a little Jewish girl in my class and the teacher said some things. This was dangerous for the teacher. My parents had tried to leave Paris, but they decided not to do it because it would have meant that we would have been separated. As Jews, we were registered at the city hall. My parents' ID cards were stamped Jewish in red, and we were not allowed to leave, to go anywhere. However, on July 16 and 17, 1942, a horrible incident happened in the middle of the night. The French police banged on doors and rounded up entire families, old people, babies, adults, and loaded them in trucks and city buses, took them to an old bicycle ring, kept them there for a week or two under horrible conditions. Then they were herded in trucks to a camp in the east of France, Drancy, an even more horrible camp. Families were separated, children were taken away from their parents. It was horrible. And then they were sent to Auschwitz, from where most didn't come back. Well, we were home that night. We were home. We were registered at the city hall, as I told you. We were registered at the city hall, and they didn't come for us. My parents found out the next morning what had happened. So when they found out, they realized that we had to leave. It was so dangerous, we couldn't stay. We couldn't stay at home. My parents had many Catholic friends, and we knew a family in particular who had two teenage boys. Those two teenage boys worked for the French resistance. So those two boys came to our apartment and they brought backpacks. My parents filled the backpacks with stuff that you take. I don't know what they put in the backpacks, photos and maybe some extra underwear, whatever you take when you are going to go away, not knowing for how long and where you're going. So that those two boys, Michel Paris and Pierre Deneux, took the backpacks and placed them in the holding area of one of the railroad stations of Paris. The night, I think it was the 30th of July, 1942, we left our apartment in the evening. My father was carrying a briefcase, my mother a pocketbook, my sister and I had our dolls, I believe. We left the apartment, turned the key, and either took the bus or walked, I'm not sure, to the house of a family, a family who was friends of ours, actually the parents of one of the boys who brought us the backpacks. So we went there. This was the very end of July, a hot evening, wearing our yellow stars. The father of the family lit the furnace. It was hot. He lit the furnace in the basement and burnt the yellow stars, which was a very dangerous thing for him to do, for himself, for his family, and for us, of course. The mother, his name was Monsieur Paris. His wife was Geneviève Paris. She was a devout Catholic, and she even tried to convert us, but she didn't succeed, and it would not have helped. But she gave my mother and my sister and me a little medal, which I still have, wishing us well. So we had dinner there, and the next morning we went by metro early in the morning without wearing our yellow stars any longer. We went to the railroad station where those two teenage boys met us. They gave my parents the backpacks. They also had bought train tickets for us. I know my parents paid for those, of course. And we went on a train, and we sat on a train, and the train didn't move, the train didn't budge. So my father very nervously gets off the train to see what's causing the delay. So he comes back a little bit later, and there had been a roundup of Jews on the train on the other side of the platform. and our train left. My sister and I, we thought we were going on vacation. We were not afraid. My parents were very afraid. Number one, we were not allowed to go anywhere. Number two, if there had been a roundup of Jews on our train, the police, the German police, would have asked for ID papers. Everybody carried ID papers in those days. My parents had ID cards stamped Jewish. So we would all have been picked up, sent to Auschwitz, never to come back. And this is actually, when I tell my story, this is the second miracle. The first miracle is when we were not picked up in our apartment. The second miracle is when there was no roundup on our train and we were able to leave. We arrive in a little town, a little village, somewhere in the center of France, where we are going to meet two local boys, a farmer and a baker, who worked for the resistance, the French resistance, and who would walk us across the demarcation line. Because at that time, under the Vichy regime, France was divided into two parts, and there was an artificial border, the demarcation line, separating those two areas of France. And in the middle of the night, one of either the baker or the farmer, I don't know, rode along that demarcation line to make sure that it was clear. And the other one followed with my sister and myself on the bicycle, and my parents ran behind. Well, again, a miracle. There was no dog, and we crossed the demarcation line safely. My parents ran behind the second bicycle, and we were greeted on the other side of the line by the French Free Army, who greeted us with the password, "Who goes there? Qui va là?" They gave us a bed. We spent the rest of the night there. The next morning, the French police came to arrest us because we had crossed the line illegally. The mayor provided a job to my father, a job in a farm. My father was not a farmer. He was a city boy. He was a businessman, but he had to earn some money. Actually, I don't even know if he was paid. He was probably given some food rather than money. The farmer had owned this farm. He also owned another property a little distance away. And this other property had an underground passage. This part of France was a center of resistance, of the French resistance, which was very, very active in this area. And there were occasionally warnings of roundups of resistance workers and of Jews. So when that happened, my father, together with other resistance workers, would go and hide in that underground passage. But other times, he would hide in the woods with the other resistance workers. And he would spend 1 night, 2 nights, 3 nights in the woods. And to signal to my father that it was safe to come home, my mother would hang a shirt in the window. I should also add that when we moved to this part of France, the southwest part of France, at that time, in July, August 1942, it was still unoccupied. By the end of the year, by November 1942, all of France was occupied. One day we were in school, And while we were in school, our house was surrounded by German army, several, 3 or 4 or 5 cars with German soldiers. My parents were upstairs. They were listening to the radio, and the German army came into the house, but they didn't hear the radio. Another miracle. They came to arrest a young man downstairs who worked for the resistance. He worked for the railroad and was suspected of working for the resistance. They arrested him. They kept him in jail for 5 weeks. They put a gun to his chin. He never revealed that there was a Jewish family hiding upstairs. So the German soldiers, the Gestapo, didn't hear the radio. If they had heard the radio, they would have gone upstairs. They would have picked up my parents. We would have come home, no parents. Life had become extremely dangerous for us. Again, my sister and I were not aware of it. And my mother was pregnant. So every Sunday, you know, in France, the French people drink wine. And so this area of France had produced wine. So every Sunday, my parents would raise the glass, toasting each other, à dimanche prochain, hoping to be alive another week. Hoping to be alive another week. My brother was born in August 1943, 10 years younger than me. They named him Franklin after Franklin Roosevelt because they thought that Roosevelt was our only hope of survival. As soon as the trains were functioning again, my father made his way back home. He found the apartment standing. The apartment had been occupied by the Gestapo. So when my father got there, the apartment was empty. My father's business was inexistent. He had to start all over again. My mother made jam, preserves, and cakes, and my father sold it door to door. But little by little, he was able to rebuild his business. Both my sister and I were given scholarship in a private school, and little by little, life rebuilt itself. What I haven't had a chance to tell is that my grandmother, whom my father had visited and encouraged to leave Germany and come to France, she refused. She stayed in Germany. Life became worse and worse for her. And she wrote to my mother that if she would be ordered to report at a certain place at a certain time, she would not do that. She would kill herself. And that's what she did. She took Veronal and committed suicide, like many, many German Jews. We survived those terrible times thanks to two main factors, I believe. First, certainly a question of luck or miracles. The fact that we were not picked up on July 16 and 17, 1942 is to this day not understandable. The fact that we were not picked up on the train as we left is not understandable. Pure miracle. The fact that the Gestapo who came into the house and my parents were upstairs listening to the illegal radio, that's ununderstandable. But the other very important factor to our survival is the help that we received. First, before we left, from our friends, our Catholic friends who helped us leave, our neighbors who did not denounce us. You know, we spent 29 months in that village. The mayor who made those false ID cards for my parents. The farmer who gave my father sort of a job. And the whole village, everybody that they knew we were refugees, they knew we were in danger, and they protected us. My life is good, and I'm happy to help by doing what I'm doing, which is to tell my World War II experience so that children, particularly children, learn that unfortunately hate exists and that they have to do everything they can to prevent hate and to help people in distress.
Manuela, it's a pleasure to see you and to let everyone who is part of this program see you now. What an amazing, amazing story. Thank you for spending your afternoon. I have to say, as I saw everyone who logged in, and we have people from here all throughout Georgia, but we have some family in San Francisco. We have some that are watching this program from England and everywhere in between. So this is truly an international program. Let me address the audience for just a moment. We are going to begin with a few remarks, and then if you have any questions, this is an opportunity to now type them into the Q&A section, to the question and answer section, and we will write them down and be asking those questions of Manuela in just a few moments. So again, please ask those through the Q&A section. Alternatively, the chat if that's a little complicated, but preferably that, and we will begin. So Manuela, let me begin with just a couple questions while we're gathering some from the audience. The film does a great job of telling your story, your immediate family story of mom and dad and your siblings. But give us a sense of your extended family. Was this a small extended family, a large extended family throughout Europe? And of course, tell us what ultimately happened to the majority of that family.
Okay. On my mother's side, there was very little. My mother was an only child. Her father died when she was a child. So she was an only child. She had her mother, to whom she was very close. And it was difficult for her to leave her mother in Hamburg when she married my father in Hamburg and moved to Paris. I think she had cousins, uncles maybe, but I really don't know anything about my mother's family. I think there was a cousin who lived in South Africa. I think I may even have met him once. But there was really hardly any family on my mother's side. On the other hand, my father, who came from Holland, had a large family. First, he had a brother and a sister, married with children. But he had many cousins all over Europe. A cousin in Palestine, still live in Israel now with children and grandchildren. He had a cousin in England, married with no children. He had several cousins in Holland. He had many cousins in Holland to whom he was very close. And fortunately, those immediate family survived. It was very difficult, they were in hiding, but they survived. On the other hand, his brother and his sister did not survive. I think they stayed in the prison. There were two cousins of mine, so they were the daughters of my father's brother, Bernard and Ivy Mendels. My two cousins, Ida and Thea, were hidden in a tiny village by the large family. They had 9 children. They were hidden for the duration of the war and survived. Their mother had left instructions that they should go, if the parents did not survive, the girls would go to California where her sister, my mother's sister, had moved with her husband and 2 children. So of my generation, there were really only my 2 cousins here in Ida.
Beautiful.
They were in California, so in Paris, we had no family.
So a question that we've gotten already is about your father. What was the occupation? What did your dad do? Tell us a little more about what type of life that you all had at that time.
Okay, my father was a businessman. So good work, and he worked very hard to support his family, his wife, my mother, and my sister and myself. He was in the food business. He traveled throughout Europe with samples of various foods, and he came back with samples from different countries. So he was traveling.
Get a boom mic. Boom.
His business was totally destroyed. But number one, during the German occupation, he had to sell his business, which he did for very little money. His partner or his employee took over the business, and he stayed behind hidden so he wouldn't be seen. But there was no business. This was in the 30s, in the late 30s, or even the early 40s, and business was very, very poor at that time, of course. So there was no income, so it was very difficult. But when we came back after the war, there was no business at all, so my father had to start from scratch. My mother would make jam, she would bake cakes, which my father would sell door to door to have a little income. Then later on, he imported 1-day-old chicken from Holland and sold those. But by then, business was picking up, and he worked hard and he succeeded.
Let's ask one more question. We're gathering all of those through the Q&A section. Again, thank you all so much. Tell me a little more about the mayor of Lagos.
Okay. The mayor was an amazing person. He was obviously popular. He was elected mayor, so he had many friends. And he helped us from the day we arrived in that little village of Legot. He met us at the station and took us to the house where my parents were able to rent 2 rooms. And then he obtained a sort of a job for my father. So this was a farmer, and the farmer was illiterate. My father wrote a work certificate to prove that he was employed and not at the charge of the government. So my father wrote a certificate, and the farmer barely signed his name. My father always told me that he was leading horses, whatever that means. I don't know what that means, but when we went back to the village many years later, the farmer's wife was still alive, and so were their children. And she told us he was actually cleaning stables, my poor father. Also, so that was the first thing that this wonderful mayor did. He got a job for my father. Later on, he fabricated false ID cards, and you saw the picture of the cards in the film. The pictures are the picture of my parents. The names were of people who had died, And my father signed his assumed name. My mother never signed hers. The two ID cards, false ID cards, survived, and I'm sure they were never used because they are in perfect condition, and we gave them to the Holocaust Museum in Washington. We found out later that the mayor made false ID cards for not only for another family that he saved, but also for the resistance workers. When we went back to the village, the mayor had died already, but his children remembered that he had a heap of false ID cards that he made for resistance workers. The resistance was very, very active in that part of France. So many years later, my sister succeeded in having him recognized as a righteous among the nations at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. Unfortunately, he had already died, so he was not able to receive the award himself. Well deserved, because you know what he did was very dangerous. He was risking his own life by doing that for us.
Thank you so much. We were seeing now the questions are flooding in. So I'm going to go to a few questions, and a lot of them circle around your flight from Paris.
Okay.
And so let me ask a few and focus in on that, and then we'll move to a different piece of your story. What did your parents tell you when you were leaving Paris? What was the reason they said for what was going on?
It's really amazing. They never told us that we were fleeing. We were actually fleeing. They told us we were going on vacation. So we were excited. My sister was 7. I was not quite 9 at that time. This was in July 1942, the end of July 1942. We were excited. It was a vacation for us.
And let me follow up. You sort of answered, but I always love when we get questions at an 11-year-old, James, who's watching this right now. And so an 11-year-old said, since you didn't know you were being invaded and that you were on that vacation, did you feel differently despite that you were in a new location? I think what he's asking is, so you went on this vacation, but it was an extended vacation. How, once you were there, what did it continue to be exciting? Did you become aware of the other circumstances that were going on?
We were excited. It was a new environment. At first, we were in that house on the ground floor, and there was at the time running water. Later on, an apartment or more rooms were available upstairs, so we moved upstairs, but there was no running water. So my sister and I had a job. We went with 2 containers. The house was located across the street from the railroad station. So we had to cross the railroad yard. We had to cross the railroad building. We had to cross the railroad tracks. And behind the tracks was a pump, a water pump. So we pumped the water and carried back upstairs. So, but it was an adventure. We were not afraid. We were never afraid, even though my mother told us at one point, and I don't know if it was before we left or if it was after we were in the village, she told us if we were going to be arrested, she would give us a little pill, which we would all swallow, and we would die instantly without pain, without being shipped away. So that's pretty scary for a child.
Mm-hmm.
And very scary for my mother. But we were never arrested. I'm here to tell the story. And what's amazing is that my sister and I, we both forgot that. You'd think it would stay with us, but it didn't. And when we went back to the village, one of my friends and one of my sister's friends reminded us that our mother would give us that pill and we would die. They knew it. So we children had told our friends about it, but we forgot all about it. Now, I can't believe it.
Very scary for a child, but everything is about
and very courageous for my mother.
Indeed.
And I don't know exactly how she obtained that poison or whatever it was she was going to give us.
Before we go away from this piece of the Paris story, Why? What do you credit? Why do you think you weren't taken away that night that the Jews were rounded up in Paris? What do you credit it to?
That was luck, number one. Our neighbors knew, they saw us walking around our neighborhood with the yellow star. They knew we were Jewish. They did not denounce us. They did not denounce us. There was a lot of denouncers. You were rewarded if you denounced a Jewish family. Nobody denounced us. My sister wrote a book about our story of survival, and she says in the book that they forgot to pick us up. I don't know. To me, it's a miracle. It's a miracle because we were registered at the city hall. We walked around the street. We went to school wearing the yellow star. So it was known that we were Jewish. So why they didn't pick us up? It's a miracle.
So actually, that's a question that was just handed to me. So when you're in the village and you were in school, didn't the other children or the other families, so they knew you were Jewish? You said you just wore Jewish stars. How do you credit it that they didn't say something?
You mean before we left?
Now when you're in the village.
Oh, in the village, we did not wear the yellow
I'm
star.
sorry. Thank you. So in the village, so one of the questions that we've just received is, why, when you were in the village, in the school, did the other children and the families just keep quiet that your family was there? How do you credit that likewise there they didn't say anything?
It's an interesting question because I have a double-edged answer. Number one, the French people were very, they hated the Germans because so many of them had lost a father, a brother, a son during the First World War. They were very patriotic, very Republican for the French Republic. Mm-hmm. So that was one reason. I don't know if they knew we were Jewish. They knew we were refugees. We looked a little different. At first, we had nice clothes coming from Paris. Later on, the nice clothes wore off. My mother unraveled the sweaters and re-knitted them to a bigger size, things like that. The priest probably encouraged the people. You know, there was in the next village, there was a church, there was a school and a town hall. So the priest went to see us and he said to us, if les Boches, the Germans come, I will hide you in my clock tower. He probably exhorted his parishioners to protect us and also to give courage to the resistance workers. However, one day, my sister and I were walking in the street with two other girls, and one of the other girls insulted us, and I cannot even repeat that insult. It's so ugly. So where did this girl hear that insult? I don't know. I will never know. So she must have heard that terrible insult.
And knew to direct it at you as a Jewish child at that time. Thank you. Thank you. Do you wish that your parents had told you more during this, as you said, an adventure, during a vacation? Do you wish you had known more about what was going on around you? Or how do you feel about that?
At the time, I didn't know any better. We were very naive. We trusted our parents 100%. There was no television. At first there were newspapers, but we didn't read, my sister and I. We were two little girls. We played with each other. We were close friends with each other. And we made friends with the other children. We didn't question my parents. Of course, now, after the fact, I wish, but my parents are not alive anymore. So I cannot ask anything. At one point, we were going to go to another village where there was a convent or a place where they took in Jewish children, and we were going to go there. We were all set to go, but then it was either a convent or an orphanage, I'm not sure. We were going to go there, my sister and I. We were all set to go, but then we heard that the road was patrolled, so we didn't go. And it's a good thing because that orphanage or convent was raided and they found some Jewish children. So we were lucky that we stayed home.
Thank you. Um, let's change the subject just a little bit. We know also that, well, those of us who know you know that you're very musical, and that that is certainly a talent in the family. So, where did you learn to play the violin? When did tell us a little more about how that came to be part of Manuela?
That was after the war. My mother gave me piano lessons, but then she wanted me to learn the violin. So we knew a man, Monsieur Chedel, who gave me 3 violin lessons. And he found a violin for me, which was actually a little too big. It was a 3/4. I was still small, and they couldn't find a half-size violin. So I started playing on the 3/4 size, which was a little too big for me, but I grew into it. So that's how I started the violin. And I've played the violin. I've taken lessons most of my life, not anymore now. And now, you know, with everything that's happening, I stopped playing. But the other day, I tuned my violin. It really needed to be tuned again. So I'm going to stop playing, except my hands are a little stiff.
Well, I've heard you play a little bit, and I can say it is quite a treat. Back in the village, was hunger an issue? Did your diet change? Did you talk about sustenance while you were in the village?
My father was not paid. There was no money, as far as I know, there was no exchange of money, but I know he brought home root vegetables. We ate a lot of root vegetables, potatoes, salsify, I don't know, root vegetables, which to this day I don't like. But in that part of France, they have a lot of walnut trees. I think it's walnut. And so I remember my father bringing home walnuts and boiling the walnut and then peeling the shell, which was very hard. And there was a pink skin around the nut. So his fingers were all pink. So my mother would bake, she would mash the nuts and make food. So we ate a lot of nuts, which is not a bad thing to eat. It's protein. Meat, I don't know if we had any meat. You know, I can't remember if we had any meat. I know that we went to school, my sister and I, with the other children in the next village. And behind the school, there was a kind of a restaurant. And the owner cooked something, des rillettes, which is pork fat with some kind of pork meat in it. And, you know, we ate what we could eat in those days. But then one day there were worms in there. So we stopped eating the rillette, and my mother prepared something with nuts, whatever she could cook for us.
A wise choice, a wise choice. During your time in Lagarde, was your family able to celebrate any of the Jewish holidays or Jewish rituals?
Not that I know.
Okay.
Not that I know.
Thank you. You talked about in the film the French resistance going on around, and were there any activities that you were aware of or you found out from your family later on that the French resistance was doing in that area?
You know, I think at the time I was not aware of it. At the time.
After the fact, did you become aware of some of the?
Of course, yeah, of course.
Of
yes.
course.
Yeah, but at the time, I don't believe so. I know that several times my father had to hide in the woods. It's a wooded part of France. Like the Dordogne is a beautiful part of France. My father had to hide in the woods with some resistant workers or men, because they were also when the south of France became occupied in November 1943. There were Germans in France, very much so, and they were looking for resistance workers, for Jews, and for men to be sent to Germany for the travail obligatoire, forced labor. So many men would hide in the woods with my father. My father also, as I show in the film, was hiding in a hole in a house that belonged to a farmer, and he spent days on end in that hole where he couldn't even stand. He was crouching and smoking. They grow tobacco in that part of France. One time, after my brother was born in August 1943, the whole family went in hiding in the woods. And my brother was a baby. How do you prevent a baby from crying? But he didn't. And we spent a night or two in the woods, the five of us. There were five of us by then. But we were able to come back to our apartment.
Well, you actually have a perfect segue because um, we have some questions about your brother Franklin. You know, and you mentioned that is one of the miracles. 4 people go into hiding
And 5 coming
and
home.
5 coming home. And so, can you tell us more about Franklin's birth?
Yes.
You know, what is some generalities about it? Certainly,
Okay.
you know, how does that? How was he born?
Okay, my mother had a very difficult pregnancy. There was not much food. She probably didn't eat the right, I'm sure she didn't eat the right food. I remember one time she had to go to a doctor and she had to go up a hill and she was very, very big and we pushed her. I remember that scene, we pushed her up the hill. Anyway, she was planning, she was hoping to have a midwife to help her with the delivery. However, my brother was in a breech position and I guess she started bleeding. So in the middle of the night, August 6, 1943, my brother was born on August 7. In the middle of the night, and I believe it was a Saturday, it was an emergency. Somehow my father was able to find a taxi and a driver to drive my mother and himself to a clinic in a different department, a different part of France, the same region, but a different county, so to speak. Um, Fortunately, there was no control. You know, we were not allowed to go in a different county. We had to stay within our immediate environment, immediate county. So fortunately, there was no control on that road, and they made it to the clinic. So it was an emergency delivery. My mother lost a lot of blood. She had a very rare blood type, very difficult to find that blood type. I think it's O or 0, but I'm not sure. My sister actually had the same blood type, but she was too young to give blood. So my father stayed with my mother in that clinic for about a month. We went to visit my mother one time. And while we were, you know, we were young. I was 10, my sister was 8. We were young. We were too young to be alone. So my father found a woman, I think she was a Spanish refugee, who stayed with us at that time while my parents were away. At first, first I want to say, my parents had my brother circumcised, which of course nowadays it's a normal thing to do, but in those days only the Jews were circumcised, so that would right away reveal you as a Jew. Why my parents decided to do it in spite of the danger, I don't know. My sister says it was for his mother, who was observant. I don't know why he did it, but he did it. They did it. So he was circumcised in the clinic. At first, he was probably lactose intolerant. He cried a lot. The nurses in the clinic said he was a bad baby, but he was probably having stomach pain. I don't know. Anyway, it was very difficult at the beginning. And then one day, somehow my father got hold of Nestle sweet condensed milk. And that did the trick. My brother then stopped crying and started growing. And I think you saw a picture of him as a lovely baby. And we were so happy, my sister and I, to have a baby brother.
Amazing. We have several more questions, and so I'm going to try to get through as many as I can in the next few minutes. But there's an old rule: don't ask a question you don't know the answer to. Well, there's another rule: don't ask a question you don't know what the question is. But I'm going to hand you something because it was submitted in French, And so I am not going to butcher the French, but I'm going to bring it across to you because to show the international nature of our discussion and let you read it and perhaps tell us, the rest of us, what the question is.
And I will be wearing my face mask.
Okay. Please, if you would, a question for our French survivor
Yes.
from a French speaker, please.
Yes, I know exactly who it is. Bonsoir, je suis Mathilde Chénet, Paris. Okay, I'll translate it.
Please translate for
Good
us.
evening. Of course, in France, it's 6 hours later. It's 8 o'clock already. I am Mathilde Chénet, Paris, the daughter, the younger daughter of Geneviève and Maurice Paris. So moved
Manuela,
to see you.
take off the mask so we can hear you more clearly, my friend.
Sorry.
That's all right.
I am so moved to see you. My mother and my aunt spoke so much of that last night before you left into the free zone. Very moving. So, yes, I know exactly who. Thank you, Mathilde. I know exactly who you are. And I told the story in the film because it's a wonderful story. The Paris, that's their name, Paris. They were Belgian, or he was Belgian. They were wonderful people, close friends of my parents. I think Monsieur Paris, Maurice, I still don't know his first name, Maurice Paris. Madame Paris, Geneviève Paris was a very devout Catholic. She even tried to convert us, which would not have helped, and it would not have helped, and my mother refused. But we spent our last night before we left in their home. It was at the very end of July 1942, very hot. Monsieur Paris lit the furnace in the basement and burned our yellow stars, which was an act of resistance, so dangerous for him, for your family, and for us, of course, you know, the yellow star. And your mother, Madame Paris, gave us this Catholic medal,
which you wear to this day.
Which I wear today when I speak to my audience, and you saw it in the movie. My sister had hers too, you know, my late sister who died last year. I don't know what happened to my mother's, and I don't usually wear it. I'm not Catholic. I wear a yellow star, if anything. But yes, I remember it very well. Of course, we have talked about it many times. And you know, when we came back in November 1944, we went directly to the Paris home. We probably spent 1 or 2 or 3 nights there as we came back from our exodus, or exile, I should say. And they were so happy to see us, and we were so happy to come back home.
Oh, that is so wonderful. And I've heard you speak so many times, but this is a unique one where we are connecting with people from your past all the way across the ocean. So
actually, she's the granddaughter.
The granddaughter. Amazing, amazing. I'm going to skip ahead just a little bit, and that, how did you come to end up being in Atlanta, Manuela? And we'll talk a little bit about did other members of your family end up coming to America?
Okay, so I left. It's a long story, but I'll make it as quick as I must. My sister got married in New York in 1958. I was still at home living with my parents. I am the older sister. And 2 years later, I decided it was time to leave home. So my sister's in-laws, Jacqueline in-laws, Mr. and Mrs. Byrne, gave me an affidavit of support so I could get a visa to go to the United States. So my plan was to spend 6 months and come back home to Paris. But I spent actually 1 year in New York. I had a wonderful time. My sister was living in New York at the time with her husband. We went to concerts. We met for lunch, had our sandwich at the foot of the Seagram building. We went to concerts. I met some of their friends. Anyway, it was time for me to move on. So I decided, I saved my money. I bought myself a 99 days, $99 bus ticket on Greyhound or Grey Line, I don't remember, to cross the United States by bus to go to California, where my two cousins lived. They were the daughters of my father's brother, Thea and Ida Mendels, although one was already married. Before I left, a friend of mine who was an American girl, whom I met. She was translator at the UN in Paris, and she had gotten married, and she was going with her husband to Vietnam. It was just before the big to-do in Vietnam. She was going to go to Vietnam. Her husband already left, and so anyway, there was a party, and I met her again, and she said, "Oh, you are going to San Francisco. We have a good friend in San Francisco. His name is Murray Bornstein. We'll write to him, and he can show you San Francisco." So I made my way to San Francisco. One of my cousins met me halfway by car. We continued, and I met Murray Bornstein. And Murray Bornstein showed me San Francisco. I met him in, I believe, September 1961. We got engaged, believe it or not, in October 1961. We got married, believe it or not, at my cousin's home in November 1961. And then we went to Paris and were married at the synagogue in Paris in December 1961. And the reason why we did it so quickly, I mean, within 3 months, and I had told my parents I was coming back to Paris. Murray was a civil engineer. He had a job waiting for him in Hawaii. So I was torn between Paris and Hawaii. He was 32, I was 28. We were not spring chickens anymore. So we did it. So he was a civil engineer. He worked in Kauai, the Garden Island, for 1 year. I got a job as a travel agent. I worked in the morning, spent the afternoon on the beach. There were a few, there was another Jewish family on the island. We celebrated Pesach together. And for the high holidays, we went to the big island, to Honolulu, to the synagogue. But anyway, after a year, it was time to go back to real life. So in 1960, so we spent all of 1962 in Hawaii. January 1963, we went back to real life. My parents, in the meantime, had moved to San Francisco. And so we settled in San Francisco. My first son was born in November 1963. Now you know our ages. My second son was born in San Francisco at the Kaiser Hospital in February 66. He has a birthday coming up very soon, 55, my baby. And anyway, so we spent from 1963 to 1972 in San Francisco. Then my husband, who worked for a large company, Parson, Brickhoff, Quaid and Douglas, was offered a transfer to the head office in New York. So we left San Francisco. My parents had already left because they knew that we were going to leave. They knew that. And also my brother was a professor, was traveling. My sister's husband was a diplomat, was traveling. So they didn't want to stay by themselves in San Francisco. So they went back to France. So my husband was offered a transfer to the head office in New York. We bought a house in Princeton Junction. We moved to Princeton Junction, where we lived for 4 years. And then the company in Atlanta, it was a joint venture of 3 companies, Parson, Brickhoff, Quaid and Douglas, and Bechtel. Bechtel left, so they needed more engineers. So we were offered a transfer to Atlanta. So in June 1976, we moved to Atlanta, and I've been here ever since. Unfortunately, my husband passed away in 1982.
And well, we've, I think, been so enlightened by your story today. I want to thank you for for giving of your time as you always do. I know this is a crazy time, but for our audience, again, which was has been over 380 computers logged in, and we think hundreds and hundreds of individuals today. Thank you so much for sharing your story. You are an amazing steward of your family. Um, I want to speak just briefly to our audience that we hope that while the Bremen is closed, that you will visit one of our many online programs. As like with all not-for-profits, we also would be more than pleased to accept support, and we will put just very briefly in the chat right now an opportunity that if you wish to make a contribution, how you can do it through a simple text message. And we hope that you will consider supporting our efforts in bringing stories like Manuela's to the greater community, both of Atlanta, but of the United States and internationally as well. So we thank you for being here today. Manuela, we thank you for giving your time. And we hope that you all will visit our website at thebremen.org and visit us again for one of our other many compelling programs online. Thank you and have a wonderful day.